In this podcast, we take a closer look at the possible risks surrounding wolves. We're doing this in response to several reports that have been published. The goal is not to scare people unnecessarily, but simply to look at the numbers and the facts and explain what they actually mean. By doing that, we hope to contribute to a more realistic picture of the wolf. The wolf is a beautiful wild animal, but like many wild animals, it also has sides that are less pleasant for us as humans. If we want to live alongside wolves, it's only fair to tell the whole story, both the good sides and the more difficult ones. From the wolf's perspective, the situation is simple. It just wants to live and reproduce. But in densely populated countries with highly human made landscapes, can people and wolves really live together without conflict or danger? In this episode of the podcast Animal Matters, I speak with Professor Dr. John Linnell. John currently works as a senior scientist at the Department Lillehammer, Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, and as a professor at the Department of Forestry and Wildlife Management at the Inland Norway University of Applied Science. John conducts interdisciplinary research on the interactions between humans and wildlife with a view to promoting coexistence. John is the leading author of the report The Fear of Wolves, a review of wolf attacks on humans, January 2002, and in 2020 the follow-up report Wolf Attacks on Humans, an update for 2002 until 2020. John, welcome.
Thank you.
I have the first question for you. In the report, Is the Fear of Wolves Justified? A Fenno-Scandian perspective out of 2003, it says that there were 94 documented fatal wolves attacks on humans in Norway, Sweden, and Finland between about 1700 and 1882, almost all involving children under 12 years old. The attacks were predatory and not related to rabies, and they seem to be concentrated in certain regions or linked to certain individual wolves. How did they conclude the attacks were predatory, and did they describe the wolves' behavior?
Wow. We're talking about fairly old information here. The most recent of these are from the early or the middle 19th century. So, an awful lot of information gets lost. And the different cases have very different degrees of description. So this Norwegian case is a single case, and it's really just known from one newspaper article. And that was more than 200 years ago. But certainly it describes a very clear situation of a wolf kind of running out of the forest, grabbing a kid, dragging it off into the forest. And then by the time the kid's friends got some adults to come along, they found that the kid had been killed and partially consumed. So certainly in case, and that type of situation is one you find described quite often in the historical information. And it certainly lets you say that this is not a rabies case, because in a rabies case, the victim is never kind of pulled away or carried away. It's never consumed. And the wolf is just basically moving on and then attacking more cats, dogs, cows, sheep, people, whatever it finds on the way. So a rabies case is very distinctive. And for most of Europe, at least in that period, it would have been very well known because kind of rabies was a fairly common feature of life, except in Norway and Sweden, where I don't think we've actually ever had it, actually. So, but in Finland, they certainly would have been familiar with what a rabies case looks like. So these kind of cases which are reported as being predatory, even at the time, are being identified as something not normal. They are unique events appearing in certain locations at certain times and then disappearing again. So the characteristics of victims being moved, dragged, and then consumed certainly tells you it's not rabies.
You say wolves can kill humans, but it's very rare. What does rare actually mean for someone who lives in an area with bold wolves that are, walking around the house, walking behind people?
It means that it is so rare that you cannot put a number onto it. You know, it's like trying to say, what is your risk of being killed in a terror attack or being struck by lightning? And it's we know it happens, right? But it's impossible to express it in a numerical term. But it does mean, though, that it can happen. And many things in life, like we deal with, where we know it can happen, but we don't put a number onto it. Simple things like we install a fire alarm in our houses. Most people will luckily never experience a house fire, but they still take the precaution of having a fire alarm in just about every house. So I think we are used to this. People are not very good at expressing risk in kind of quantitative terms. You can obviously calculate what's your risk of dying from a heart attack or a stroke, but it doesn't mean anything when you express it that way anyway. So I don't think it's so important to be able to quantify it. I think the most important thing is to say that actually, well, it is a risk. It's very, very small, but it is present. And that's like many of the risks that we take up seriously, but we don't let it destroy our lives.
Wolves are now returning to densely populated country like the Netherlands, with a highly managed landscape and lots of recreation in nature area. Does that make the situation different from places like Scandinavia? And does it change the risk, you think?
Yeah, that is really one of the big questions that we actually have. And it's an area where we really just simply don't have enough experience to really, concretely say with, a data supported opinion. This whole expansion of wolves into the more densely populated parts of Europe has been going on for like maybe 20, 30 years, and the arrival in places like the Netherlands, this is a really recent event. And there's really very little experience in modern times from this type of situation. So luckily, our data is actually quite slim. Like the fact that attacks are so few is a very, very good thing. But of course, it means then we don't have much data to build on. So, every event that happens is a fairly unusual thing, which is making a contribution to our understanding. But we are so far away from having that really concrete understanding. But if we are just sort of speculating a bit from, first principles and general knowledge, certainly I think you can say that the preconditions for problems may be greater in such a landscape, because any wolf living in a country like the Netherlands will be very much exposed to humans, maybe not face to face, but at a distance, right? And just to live in a landscape like that, the wolves have to be very good at navigating the human landscape. The roads, the fields, other barriers, hiking trails, farmyards. So they obviously become very accustomed to people. That in itself may not be a problem. And in many ways, that actually is a prerequisite for wolves to live there. But it also creates a much tighter, or more interfaces and more contact points where wolves and people are going to meet. You have lots of wolves, lots of people, so simply the opportunity for encounters is much, much higher, which statistically probably creates kind of more situations where something might happen. But it doesn't mean it will happen, right? So here we're getting to that world of probabilities again and risk factors. But it's very difficult to put numbers on this. And we're talking about a change from rare, from very, very rare to maybe only very rare. But the situations are there. They cannot be ignored.
In your report, The Fear of Wolves, a review of wolf attacks on humans 2002, updated 2020, you describe 4 factors that can lead to dangerous situations. In what circumstances can things actually go wrong? You mentioned habituation, wolves becoming less afraid of people as a risk factor. How can we recognize when habituation is happening?
So if we go back to those four factors, this was based upon our analysis of data collected over maybe 200 or 300 years. And during that time period, many things have changed. So if we're looking at the older historical data, you see kind of that rabies is a major factor. And today, that's totally absent from a European context because we managed to push rabies out of Europe. But we still see this as a factor in like Central Asia, Middle East, India, and so on. The other factor we see a lot in the historical context are these circumstances where you have landscapes with very little wild prey because it's been hunted out, where the habitat has been really destroyed. And the main prey of the wolf is either going to be livestock or garbage, I guess. And typically, historically, the main thing standing between the wolf and livestock would have been a shepherd, which would very often have been quite a young child. So these kind of situations created, again, the preconditions for interaction. And again, that's something that we don't have today in Europe. We have much more kind of forest than we've had for centuries. We have much more wild prey than we've had for many centuries. And we typically do not send very young children out as shepherds to protect livestock. So that situation, again, is gone from a European context. But we still see that in parts of, say, India, Middle East, and Central Asia. So, but it's gone from our world. So then it moves on to this sort of issue of habituation. And this is sort of something new, which we have no historical precedents for. We do see cases where wolves, which have been living close to people, can occasionally attack. And in some cases, these wolves were not really showing any warning signs at all. They were just living in regular proximity to people. In other cases, there were certainly indications that something was going wrong. You know, that the wolf was not frightened of people. So I guess this means we're looking at like, we have to understand there's a gradient of habituation. And a wolf being able to live in a modern European landscape has to be able to habituate to human structures, to roads and fences and farms and this type of stuff, hiking trails, and be able to tolerate being in the proximity of people or navigating that landscape at night. And that is sort of simply a necessary adaptation the wolves have to live here. And it's not something to be concerned about. The problem is not when the wolf is encountering human structures, but when the wolf is encountering humans. And when it can identify the object as a human. Like a person in a car is an abstraction, right? It's a car. But when it's face to face with a person, and when the wolf begins to show either a lack of shyness or even worse, an attraction, that is when you need to beginning to think very carefully about what's actually happening, especially when it's approaching. And if it starts to kind of follow, then certainly the alarm bells have to ring. So there's no kind of totally clear black and white kind of transition here, but the main kind of warning signal is when it goes from tolerating human structures to tolerating humans face to face.
In your report, it says that in predatory attacks, children were often the victims. Why children in particular? Why children under 12 years old?
So this is, well, most of this is coming from the historical literature. And it's largely because they're small. And like humans have never been natural prey of wolves. So when, for some very fortunate reason, just about everything treats people with more respect than we actually deserve based upon our body size and our physical ability to defend ourselves. And this isn't just wolves. This is basically all predators seem to treat us with more respect. And maybe this is because they realize that we're dangerous, or maybe it's simply because of our verticality. The fact that we stand vertical. No other prey is vertical. So we do get respect, which means that when a wolf is going to attack a person, it's crossing some type of line from, what is normal to what is not normal. Very few wolves will ever have attacked anybody before. And in that kind of step, it means that it's kind of logical from their point of view to focus on small ones, right? In the same way if they're hunting, it's much easier to kill a calf than an adult. I guess also in the past, children were very vulnerable, and that they were put out there to defend livestock or to work in the fields and stuff. So they were just encountered more often, but I think it's the size, which is the main point. What is interesting or disturbing is that in the few cases that we see in Europe in recent times, it also seems to be children who get attacked. And I guess it boils down simply to their size.
Incidents with children, and we had an incident in the Netherlands. Do these incidents suggest that we should warn more clearly about possible risk, do more targeted research in what type of wolves and what circumstances could lead to predation on children?
Yeah, I think in the modern, yes. The answer to everything is yes, I think. That the messaging around wolves has to be fairly clear, and that, I think it goes actually for all wildlife, is that we certainly need to communicate the reality of these animals. As well as kind of communicating messages, about the ethical basis of conservation, or the fact that people find these animals beautiful and inspiring and whatever effect they have on the ecology. We do need to communicate the fact that there are negative aspects of it. The fact that they kill livestock, I think everyone accepts now. That is a reality, and it's not just sheep. It can also be cows, it can be horses in a few but rare cases, but it happens. When it comes to attacking dogs, we need to be honest about that and say wolves do kill dogs. And we do need to get the messaging across that wolves, in exceptional circumstances, can attack humans. So getting across that risk is really important. But I don't think that is such a complicated task, because every child is also taught that when you encounter a dog, you need to be careful. Or you should ask the owner, can I pat your dog? So we manage this with everything. You say, well, dogs are cute and cuddly, but you have to be careful. And we do the same thing with cows. You say, well, if you're walking on the field and there's cattle there, it's okay, but you have to be careful. So it's nothing particularly exceptional about this type of messaging. You are not trying to make people scared. You're just trying to make people learn respect. But somehow, in some of the conservation messaging, there has been an unfortunate tendency to kind of idolize wolves, especially. Part of this has been sort of maybe a necessary part of the conservation messaging, in that you're trying to make people feel empathy and try to maybe overcome some of this often irrational levels of fear that we have. But sometimes this conservation messaging goes a bit too far, and it somehow turns the wolf from being a large predator into being some type of idealized thing. And it would be very surprising if a predatory animal, that kills deer, was not actually capable of hurting people. That would almost be impossible to understand. And I think we shouldn't be scared of this. Like with bears, no one argues whether bears can be dangerous. The fact that bears attacks happen is common knowledge, right? And people hiking in Alaska, they carry pepper spray or make noise, and it doesn't diminish the motivation to conserve bears. But somehow wolves have been in this sort of polarized, they're either demons or they're angels, and the reality, a wolf is a wolf. It has its positive sides, and it also has its bad sides. And I don't think we should be frightened of that. In fact, that we should encourage this, because it would almost be weird if they weren't actually potentially dangerous in some situations. Even a wild boar is dangerous, you know. So I think we just need to be honest in the communication.
What information should the media, according to you, always include when reporting an incident, for example, distance, behavior, presence of foods, etc., so the public can better understand what actually happened?
If an attack happens, it is such a rare event that obviously media have a really strong interest in this. No, it is a very sensational happening. And this is where can media have, I think, a major responsibility, because the politics of wolf conservation are very strong. Certainly, in any sensational case, media have an obligation to really get the facts kind of straight. And especially, actually, the more sensational the event, the greater the responsibility to actually fact check it. But certainly, step one for media is, was this really a wolf? You know, and sometimes that may not actually be easy to say if there's no witness to it, right? Step two is try to get to what were the circumstances behind this, right? And context is almost everything. It's like driving, you know. If there's a car crash and the driver's drunk, it's not very sensational. You know, if the driver's not drunk, then it's a totally different thing. Same thing in a wolf attack. Questions like, you know, where did it happen? You know, if it happens in a forest or happens in a farmyard or a garden, that's a very different circumstance. If there's a dog involved, if there were adults present or not, if the wolf had a history of approaching people or not, if there had been some food or garbage that the wolf had been accustomed to coming to. These are all kind of mitigating circumstances. Like sometimes we have fairly well documented cases of wolf attacks which came with no warning at all and no underlying conditions. So it can happen, like the lightning coming from a clear sky. But very often there is something going on there. There's a history to it, or there's been some food the wolf has been coming to, or some warning signs. It rarely does come out of that clear sky, but it can do. So we do need to be open-minded about situations.
In the Netherlands, wolves are increasingly seen walking through build-up areas during the day, and these are not always wolves just passing through, but also wolves that have their territory in that area. Is this also seen in other countries? And how can it be prevented? And what measures should be taken?
So this is a question then about where on these sort of gradients you draw the line between, you know, acceptable, concerning, and very concerning. The fact that wolves walk close to human buildings, infrastructure at night is normal, right? Like just to give you an example, in Scandinavia during winter, you often see wolf tracks on the roads passing close to houses. And it's often because, well, that's where the snowplow has been. And the wolves aren't stupid. They don't spend energy walking through deep snow if they can walk on the plowed road, you know. And that is basically normal. If the wolves start doing that during daytime, when they can be seen, that is certainly one step of escalation. It doesn't mean it's a problem. Like, for example, in some of the bigger national parks, like say in the Yellowstone National Park, you will also often see wolves moving in daytime, showing themselves to people, but not posing any threat. So it doesn't have to be a problem, but it is certainly, you know, an indication that the habituation has crossed a major line, you know, and certainly these are the situations that you need to begin to monitor very carefully, and somebody needs to be following up. So, because this is when you're coming into that situation where the wolf is comfortable around people, you know, and obviously you can have a wolf that gets stuck in a place where it didn't know and it's trying to find a way out. But if the wolf is moving very casually through such places, then certainly you've moved from one situation to a new situation, and monitoring this situation carefully is really essential, especially if it repeats itself.
Deterring Wolves sometimes work, sometimes doesn't. How long should that be tried before concluding it doesn't work?
Yeah, so this idea of changing behavior of the animals, the evidence for its success is not very high, largely because it's very difficult. It's often very difficult to do it, and it's very difficult to monitor its effect. So you almost would need to actually have put a GPS collar onto the wolf in advance to actually be able to effectively monitor it and then to determine the effect of it. So the evidence that we have here is a selection of anecdotes. And actually, it can be surprisingly hard to do it because very often you hear about this wolf, which is, oh, it gets very close to people. And then if someone goes there with, say, a paintball gun or rubber bullets or firecrackers, well, you find actually, well, it's very difficult to get close to the wolf, right? And you have to be quite close to deter it. So I would guess from the fragments of information that we have and the anecdotes, you could sort of interpret that maybe with young animals who are just being curious and naive, that might be easier to actually change this behavior. With older animals, we have anecdotes that go in both ways, that yes, that wolf doesn't ever start the behavior again, but maybe it wasn't really a problem anyway. Maybe it was only a few unusual situations that led to the intervention. And in other cases, people have intervened and have not managed to change it. So it's a useful tool to have to try it. But in practice, it is a very difficult tool to actually really implement and difficult to follow up. But it's good to have it. The only other alternative is to kill the wolf. And that is obviously a very kind of controversial step. And if the circumstances allow, it's very good that people try other interventions. But we certainly need to be clear that our evidence base is small, and it is very difficult to collect evidence on this. And it would, in principle, need a collar on the wolf. And even that can be a challenging activity. Everyone seems to have the instinct to, take out a cell phone, film it, try and get a selfie, call it over, try to give it a sandwich, and this is basically just taking steps which will ultimately lead to that wolf dying. So I think if everyone's first reaction was to be much more aggressive and assertive, this would probably have been a good way of doing it.
If safety and nature conservation come into conflict, which should weigh more heavily?
It's always going to be a balance. And it's not just nature conservation. It's every activity that humans engage in has a safety element attached to it. We have this with food health and food safety, and we have this with transport. We have this with everything we do. There is a safety component to it. So it's nothing special about nature conservation. And even within nature conservation, it's not just on the wolf, right? Having wild boar or red deer in a landscape is a safety issue because of the vehicle collisions that you have on the roads. People die in vehicle collisions with supposedly innocent animals like deer and boar. It's always a part of the equation. And nature is no different from the human world. That there are obviously always risks when you go outside in nature. There are risks of, you can fall off mountains, you can drown in rivers, so the natural arena is not a sort of a play park, which is kind of sanitized from all sort of dangers. And in many ways, that is part of the attraction of actually visiting nature, is that you are going to some place which is a little bit less controlled, less regulated, less sanitized of risk. But of course, we like those risks to be controlled, right, and to be managed. And while there'll always be a risk associated with nature and with wild animals, which partially has to be accepted, we obviously don't want these risks to be greater than they are. And if you have some individual animal or a pack or whatever that's showing signs of disproportionate risk, then obviously we need to react. It's like if you have a hiking trail, it's nice to have trees, but it is a tree which is leaning half over the trail and whipping in the wind and about to break, well, I think it's appreciated that someone takes a chainsaw and takes it away. Not taking all the trees that might fall over, but you certainly react to that one tree which is looking like it will do. So it's this question of kind of balancing. We can never say nature is without risks, but we can obviously take steps to minimize that, or at least to take away the more extreme parts of it.
Is there consensus among wolf experts on how to deal with a bold wolf? As an outsider, I get the impression that even among professionals, there are different opinions. Is that correct?
Certainly, there are different opinions, and I would guess that there are multiple sources of these differences. One source is kind of unavoidable in that the evidence base for this type of stuff is thankfully very low. Simply we don't have so many cases, and that is a blessing. I'd be really happy if we never collected any more data. If there were no more attacks, no more bold wolves, I would be really happy not to have an extra data point, because every data point is actually sometimes, can be a very stressful or tragic experience. So that lack of concrete evidence obviously creates a space for different opinions. Also, different experts come with different experiences, right? Depending on which country you live in, which continent you live in, you have a whole different background of encounters. And then obviously different experts have different individual values. There are some people who maybe come from maybe a more wildlife management background, where killing an animal is not necessarily a major problem. When you're used to managing huntable species and hunting quotas, then killing an animal, if it's a red deer or a wolf, it's it's not some type of special situation, but is something that's more normal. And especially like in Northern Europe or parts of Eastern Europe, this is much more normal than in Western Europe. But then also people that have very different personal values about killing. And some people think, well, we should not kill animals. People with a stronger animal welfare background or more animal rights background are principally opposed to actually animals being killed, or at least they have a totally different threshold. So this sort of professional and personal baggage that an expert brings into the conversation will obviously lead to a diversity of perspectives on what you do and where the threshold is. And in many cases, kind of like I said several times, we don't have the data that we'd like to have. And this whole thing is a new phenomenon that we actually are learning as we go. And what's really important is that we learn from every case. We should try to learn as much as we can and try to build that sort of evidence base where we could actually say with much more confidence that we know what we're doing. The question is, when we don't have the evidence base, then we still have to act. All right. And this is sort of the situation which every scientist hates. When you're being asked for a recommendation, but you don't have the data or the evidence that you'd like to have. So you're having to make a sort of a recommendation or a decision in the face of uncertainty, based on first principles or intuition or a collection of anecdotal examples that tell you slightly different things. But you do have to act. You cannot just postpone every decision in life waiting for more evidence. Sometimes decisions have to be made. And then the question is, who gets the benefit of the doubt? Is it on the wolf, or is it the human safety issue? And certainly from my perspective, at least, I would say that the human safety needs to get the benefit of the doubt in these cases. Of course, it doesn't mean you kill every wolf that might hurt somebody. But when you get a situation where the alarm bells start to ring, certainly the benefit of doubt should go to the human safety point of view.
What is the most important thing governments should do to prevent wolves from developing problem behavior in the first place?
So what governments can do, I'm guessing that the main point here is in messaging. That there needs to be a very clear sort of communication about what people can do to prevent this from happening. And that certainly means don't feed wolves, right? Don't try to attract them. It's not cute if they're coming and taking a sandwich, right? And even though obviously people, like for decades, we have been trying to encourage a feeling of empathy among the public towards wolves. And people sometimes extrapolate that empathy with, oh, it's an animal, I want to be nice to it, I want to feed it. But if you take that same kind of analogy, everyone wants to have empathy for their kids. It doesn't mean you stuff them full of chocolate every day. So it's sort of, you can show empathy without having to give it a sandwich or feed it the whole time. And trying to encourage that distance will certainly help. A culture of keeping your dog on a lead when you're in natural areas would also not only benefit the wolf, but also benefit wildlife in general. And I think the other thing that can really help here is that if it's communicated that if a wolf begins to develop problem behavior, it will get shot. That actually is a very powerful incentive among the public to not actually encourage it, because actually if it leads to an animal being killed, they don't want that. But then maybe they should try to keep it at a distance. But not every case happens because people have been doing something wrong, right? Sometimes simply the wolf is just learning it for itself, despite that. And I think really the important thing that governments have to do is that to communicate that there are red lines. There are situations where certain behaviors are simply not going to be tolerated, and where the government is willing to step in to protect people. So people have to know that their safety, or even their perception of safety, is actually being taken seriously. This doesn't mean you start shooting hundreds of wolves, but it just means that the fact that it can happen if certain lines are crossed. The question, of course, is where do you draw these lines, right? But I think people really need to know that there will be a reaction, but they don't have to welcome the wolves into the kitchen every day, before something happens. So it's communicating, but it's a very hard task, right? Because it's very subtle messages. They're not black and white. They're not totally clear. There's a lot of subjectivity behind it. But that's simply what governments have to do.
Last question. We have already mentioned it early in this podcast. The wolf is a wild animal, and like every wild animal, it has beautiful qualities, but its presence can also have disadvantages. What makes the wolf so special to you?
I find so special is actually the type of things that we have been talking about today. This very challenging relationship they have with people. The fact that we love it, we hate it, we fear it, we admire it, we respect it. We have this sort of push-pull, attraction, repulsion relationship to it. And to me, the wolf is this amazing window into the complexity of human affinity for nature in general, but the large mammals in particular. We've always had this, right? You look at kind of cave paintings, in Spain and France, like 35,000 years ago, our early human ancestors were painting wildlife on the caves, not because it gave them a benefit, but because it meant something to them, and wildlife does mean something to people. It means many different things to many different people. But the wolf is one of the extreme cases. But then again, you rarely hear anybody say they don't want wolves to exist. I've never heard anyone actually not express admiration for the wolf, right, as a species. It's just a question of how should we live with it, and this modern situation where we have wolves now returning all over Europe to this modern landscape, and that we have moved from this more antagonistic past to this effort to try to find kind of coexistence. That is something we've never tried before in human history, right? So we're trying to do something that we've never done before. We don't have the answers. No one knows how coexistence actually should look. It's a process where we're trying to define a new relationship between people and wolves. And to me, that is the most kind of fascinating part of it. I have like many colleagues who are much more kind of concerned about the ecology of wolves, which is a whole chapter of its own. But to me personally, it is this human-wolf relationship that really triggers me. And it also triggers, I think, a lot of very important messages about human-human relationships. Like the way that we discuss different opinions and the way that we try to accommodate different values into the same space, I think is a very important insight into how we would like human society to work as a whole, which has kind of messages going way beyond wolves and to nature conservation and society in general. So the wolf is a really amazing window into the human relationship with natural world and with our fellow humans.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. That was fun.